It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now we continue our election series, 30 issues in 30 days. Today it's issue 25, city-run grocery stores. It's one of mayoral frontrunner Zohran Mamdani's big campaign promises to establish a network of city-owned, low-cost grocery stores, one in each borough, to combat rising prices and, in particular, food deserts. These grocery stores would exist as a public resource under a Mamdani administration, not as a profit-seeking business. Critics say the plan is fiscally irresponsible. That's their side. Joining us now is Yasmin Tayag, staff writer at The Atlantic, to talk about what Mamdani's grocery store proposal could look like in practice, how other cities have tried similar experiments. She's looked at that in depth, and what the skepticism around it tells us about food access and affordability in New York. Hi, Yasmin. Welcome back to WNYC.
Hi, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
Can you first explain the proposal in more detail? Because I think people hear this as kind of a bumper sticker, and then most of the coverage goes on to other things. City-run grocery stores. How would they work?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you describe it as a bumper sticker because that's kind of all the detail we have from Mamdani. So his proposal is to build a network of city-owned affordable grocery stores, and he wants to start with a pilot of 5 grocery stores, one in each of the boroughs. And his argument for this is that the city could cover the store's rent and other, property-related taxes and operating costs, and the stores won't seek a profit, and thus allow the grocery store to sell food at cost to New Yorkers, so a much cheaper grocery store. And he's hoping that this will combat price gouging by the current grocery stores that we have.
How would they obtain food differently from commercial grocery stores, if they would, and how would they figure out how to price it? Because they're going to have to buy the food, and you estimate it's a $60 million experiment in your article.
That's his estimate.
That's his number. Okay.
Yeah, I've seen other experts put that estimate closer to 400 million, which, big difference. But to get back to your question about how the city would source this food, this is like one of the major issues with this proposal. The hardest part for a city-owned grocery would be getting a it would be to compete with the big box groceries like Walmart, Costco, for low prices from suppliers. So the publicly owned grocery stores would likely be getting their supply from the same places as big box grocery stores. And if they're not buying at scale, then it will be tougher to negotiate cheaper prices.
Here's a clip of Mamdani on News 12, the Long Island cable channel, talking a little bit about this.
A network of municipal-run grocery stores, one in each borough, so 5 in total, would cost the city $60 million. The city is already set to spend more than $140 million subsidizing corporate supermarket chains without any guarantee of affordability from that subsidy. So this is less than half of what we're already set to spend.
The city government subsidizes corporate grocery chains. Can you confirm that?
Yeah, there are a lot of tax subsidies for grocery stores. Some, involve tax incentives to open in underserved areas. And, these can look like rent subsidies, property subsidies. And as for the 140 million number that Mamdani quotes, I don't quite know how he calculated that, but I think it is true that the city does spend millions subsidizing grocery stores.
All right. Listeners, we can take comments and questions on this. First, if anybody has an opinion, you can call in. If anybody has experience with publicly run grocery stores, and we're going to give you a few examples of ones that do exist, or if anybody has a question for Yasmin Tayag, staff writer at The Atlantic, 212-433-WNYC, call or text, 212-433-9692. And mostly the reason we invited Yasmin on for this is that she wrote about places elsewhere in the country where it's been tried, and we're going to get into some of that. But plot twist first, New York already has a few publicly owned grocery stores, I see, and yet Mamdani's proposal would eliminate rent. What are these public grocery stores that already exist?
They're not quite public groceries in the sense that, in the way that Zohran is pitching, but we have public grocery spaces. I'm thinking of the Essex Street Market, which is a city-owned space in which individual grocers set up stalls at lower rent. So, these have existed since the 1930s. And the other type of, publicly supported grocery stores, we can call them, are the military commissaries. This is a point that's brought up by a lot of advocates for Mamdani's grocery plan. Groceries run by the military and, thus supported by the government, sell groceries to military families and veterans at, prices that are 18 to 25% cheaper than private markets. And, the closest one to us is probably Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn. Huh. And, those have been around for a long time and can be taken as evidence that a government-supported grocery store can run quite well and bring down costs.
Do you know why there are military commissaries in a place like Brooklyn? Is the assumption that military salaries are so low? Because these are for current enlisted people, I understand, right? Is that right? And so is it that military salaries are so low that the government has decided that they need subsidized grocery stores? They can't just go to pick the grocery store chain of your choice and shop like other people?
I don't actually know the reason why they exist, but they've been around for a very long time.
All right. Now, in your article, you found that mostly smaller towns or cities, places like St. Paul. Is it St. Paul, Minnesota, or is there a St. Paul, Kansas as well?
It's a St. Paul, Kansas.
Wow. And Baldwin, Florida, another place I never heard of. I know Baldwin, Long Island, but I don't know Baldwin, Florida, have already tried this. Give us an example of how it works in one of those places.
Yeah, so the precedents we have for publicly owned grocery stores have, like you said, they've mostly existed in rural areas, places with like a little over 1,000 people. And the motivation to have publicly grocery-owned stores in these places has largely been a lack of grocery stores. In St. Paul, Kansas, which has its own publicly owned grocery stores, they had not had a supermarket since 1985 before they opened their publicly owned store in 2008. And in these places, people either have, like, without the publicly owned store, people either have to subsist on dollar stores, convenience store food, or drive to the nearest big city where there's a big box store like a Walmart or Albertsons, which is like not feasible for many of the people in these communities, especially because a lot of them are older and just don't have the means to get around. And in these places, the outcomes have been mixed. Baldwin, Florida, they lost their only grocery store in 2018. They opened their own store, but that ended up closing because it was just really hard to run. It was hard to operate. It was hard to keep costs down. And so, Baldwin, Florida, Erie, Kansas, I believe, also struggled to keep their store open. But, there's
Come on,
precedent.
everybody knows Erie is where Buffalo is. Anyway, go ahead. I'm kidding.
Yeah, our only Erie is the Erie Canal. Um, but the St. Paul supermarket is sort of the bright light here. Theirs has been open for since 2013 and currently shows no signs of closing. Um, and the reasons that it has succeeded is have been largely chalked up to what my sources told me is community buy-in. The people who lived in that city wanted to keep this supermarket alive, kind of because it, obviously kept the population fed, but it also provided jobs. It also recruited people to come to this town, which otherwise, is at risk of disappearing. And so, one of my sources told me that St. Paul supermarket acted as a retention strategy, but also a recruitment strategy for newcomers.
So, is there anything for a gigantic city like New York to learn from these small towns, whether the publicly run grocery store there succeeded or failed, because you're giving us examples of each? Places like St. Paul, Kansas, or Baldwin, Florida, can you extrapolate from those experiences at all to what might happen with having one in each borough in New York City?
I think a few things. So one of the biggest things that came out of all of these examples I listed is that grocery stores are really hard to run. They're hard to operate, they're hard to supply, they're hard to keep stocked. And my concern with Mamdani's proposal is it takes real expertise to run a grocery store, much less one that has, the ambition of having very low prices. I think the community buy-in aspect is really important from what we learned from the St. Paul supermarket. People have to want to go there. They have to want it to exist. And at least, going by one of the more recent surveys I've seen, most New Yorkers do support this idea. And I think the other big thing that the city would take from these examples is that supplying or buying a supply of low-cost groceries is hard. Again, like I said, they're competing with big box stores for the supply, and if they can't buy at scale, they're unlikely to get as low a price as those bigger chains.
And if this is polling well in the city, as you indicate, I wonder if one of the reasons is that New York's poverty rate, which is twice the national average, leaves us with the stats that I think you have, and I've seen stats like this elsewhere. 1 in 3 New Yorkers relied on food pantries sometime between 2020 and 2023. Now, those were the pandemic years, the early years of those, but there's still a lot of relying on food pantries and soup kitchens, and they say that's going to get worse with the cutbacks coming in SNAP benefits from the federal government. Does that help explain why this proposal seems to be resonating in the polls?
I certainly would think so. The fact that the cost of food in New York City has gone up over 50% since 2012. And the rate that those costs have risen is far greater than the rate that people's incomes have increased. So, it's becoming harder and harder to buy food, and this is particularly hitting, the poorest New Yorkers. The latest data from our comptroller shows that one out of 9 households are considered food insecure. Most are I think the highest percentage of food insecure households is in the Bronx, where it's close to 20%, if not more. And with the coming SNAP cuts, which are going to affect some 300,000 households, and the added impact of tariffs on our groceries plus inflation, yeah, people are worried about the cost of food. And I
We
can
have
understand why they'd invite, sorry, why
yes,
they'd
what
I can
invite
understand
this
why they would
proposal.
embrace any change.
Yeah. We have a few skeptics calling in. We'll get to one or two of those. Peter, you will be second. Peter in Midtown, we see you. But first, we're going to take Annette in Brooklyn because she's got experience, it looks like, with the military grocery stores, publicly subsidized by the federal government that we referenced before and weren't quite sure why they're there. Annette, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling.
Yes. Hi, Brian. Good morning, everyone. So, yeah, I called in to mention that I do live in Brooklyn. I live in the Prospect Heights area, and I'm also retired Army military. I served for 22 years, and I drive to Fort Hamilton to do major grocery shopping because it's a sizable difference in price. The pricing, and I'm talking in excess of $5 to $10 difference in the grocery prices, meaning that there is really no need to revamp. It already exists. The government, and in this case would be city government, being able to subsidize grocery, the system already exists. It's all about mirroring what's already being done. Why the military subsidized groceries? Because of the pay. There is a difference in pay, in military pay in comparison to civilians. Maybe now is probably comparable, but yeah, I just wanted to make that point that there is a sizable difference in the prices of food.
Thank you for that context, Annette. We really appreciate it. All right, now to Peter in Midtown. You're on WNYC. Hi, Peter.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I was actually doing some quick homework while I was on hold about the history of the commissaries, by the way. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that really popped out to me while I was looking is that it is a benefit for military people. It is not something that should be applied to the general population. So, I mean, we can all support our troops and the people that serve. I think that's fair. But I was actually calling because I know a couple that runs a smaller grocery store. It's called the Food Universe on the Upper East Side, 96th and Lexington Avenue. This is a Korean couple, immigrant couple. It's a family-run business. They know their neighborhood. They have the nicest staff, and they're tireless workers. I have been in there at 8 o'clock in the morning and seen them there late at night. They work long hours. And in my conversations with the owners, they struggle as it is with making a living. They are dealing with so many different issues, and it is exasperating for them. They are being pushed out or affected by large chains and by Amazon. And this to me is a striking reason why the idea of city-run grocery stores is so abhorrent to anybody who cares about small business owners just trying to make an honest living.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, and maybe the couple that you know that owns this grocery store has addressed it, or maybe not. I think the Mamdani proposal is to locate them, since there's only going to be one in each borough, in places where there are so-called food deserts. And so that may not be the case, almost by definition, where the people you know own a grocery store, so a grocery store exists there. And are they concerned that this would actually compete with them as opposed to serving an underserved other part of the city?
I have not asked them this, but I will just say this from my own belief, is that we're talking about slippery slope politics here. You have one grocery store that is city-owned, and it opens up the way for others. It eventually, we will all be paying for this in higher taxes, and just like the free bus rides, how do you have free bus and then not end up ever clawing back in the system where people need to get on the bus and pay?
Peter, thank you for your call. All right. Well, the slippery slope argument is a hypothetical. But Yasmin, is this consistent with what your reporting has indicated? If you've looked, I know your reporting was mostly what's happened in other smaller places. But do you know enough to say that a lot of grocery store owners in New York City are expressing this concern, whether it's the slippery slope concern that, put one in each borough at first and soon they'll be all over and we're all going to go out of business, or even that the one would actually compete if their grocery stores are not in the same neighborhood?
Yeah, I would say Peter's arguments align with the main criticisms of Zohran's grocery plan, which is, these government-owned stores are going to compete with small businesses, bodegas, run them out of business. And it's unfair of Mamdani to, point to grocery stores for price gouging when they're not actually making all that much money in the first place. That part is true. Like the profit margins for a grocery store are famously very slim. It's like 1% to 3%. But I think the problem here, I think there's two issues. One, the slippery slope argument, sure, if like half the grocery stores in New York City someday become publicly owned, will it, squash small businesses? Probably. But, I think it's important to be realistic about what Mamdani can do in 4 years. He's setting up 5. They are going to be in food deserts. We're not talking the Upper East Side. We're talking like deep Queens, deep, Coney Island. Those are like the biggest food deserts in the metro area. Are they really going to, squash local bodegas? I don't think so. And to Peter's point, I understand, of course, like it makes sense that there are grocery stores that are really struggling, but I think their biggest competition is like the big box stores, like Amazon. The Costco on the Upper East Side. I don't think it's going to be like the one grocery store that is set up far away from that area.
I want to acknowledge, as we start to run out of time, that we're getting a number of calls and texts from people who are members of the Park Slope Co-op, Park Slope Food Co-op,
yes.
in particular, with a few different points of view on this. So let me go to a couple of these briefly. Russell in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Russell. Can you do it in about 30 seconds?
Sure. I'd say that, I'm a member of the co-op for a long time. Prices are extremely high. Even with, free labor, margins are extremely thin. And
for people who don't know, food co-ops, it's run basically by volunteers. You could tell me if there are any paid employees, but largely members volunteer their time, and it's a nonprofit.
It's a nonprofit. There are paid members, paid workers who are actually like expertise in sourcing groceries. It is not a simple business. The city's efficiency to do this, we have, a number of produce buyers and all sorts of things. And even despite the fact that there is no labor cost for the co-op, right, or it's very minimal, the prices are still extraordinarily high. So unless we're going to completely subsidize all the food, which is, again, going to be a policy position, but these are thin at best, and even when margins are not a topic of concern, prices are still high because food inflation is really high.
Yeah, but the difference is the Park Slope Food Co-op has to support itself. This, by definition, would be subsidized by tax dollars. Are you concerned that there would be competition for the food co-op, that it would hurt the Park Slope Food Co-op, or are you just using that as an example of how hard it is to maintain affordability?
I'm just using that as an example of how unprofitable these ventures can be, and if 5 stores, I understand it's perhaps a start, but unless you have scale through use, and your guest was saying you need community buy-in. I mean, The co-op is very populated, but if people don't want to go there, it's going to be a failure.
It's not going to work. Russell, thank you very much. One more from a Park Slope Food Co-op member, John in Astoria, who I think is going to say it could be used as a model for these. John, is that right? And we have 30 seconds for you.
Yes. And I have to disagree with the previous Park Slope Food Co-op member. Prices are high, but relative to regular grocery stores, they're cheaper for the same product, a lot cheaper. I think the co-op keeps its markup to 26% and still runs very effectively. And yes, it needs expertise, but one advantage, I believe, would be that the real estate tax would not be there for a city-owned grocery store. And it does need community buy-in. And you could use like a somewhat model similar to the co-op, where if you volunteered labor, you would even get more of a discount.
Members of the Park Slope Food Co-op disagreeing with each other? I'm shocked. John,
There's
thank you very
more
much.
drama there.
That's right. More drama on the weekend over the vegetable aisle. All right, we're going to leave it there. That's issue 25 in our 30 issues in 30 days election series around the proposal from Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic nominee, for a city-run grocery store in each borough to make food more affordable for people who can't afford it now. My guest has been Yasmin Tayag, staff writer at The Atlantic. You can read her piece, New York is Hungry for a Big Grocery Experiment. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Brian.